In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent, and there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees. And she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh." And she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention, and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights, and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here, and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground, and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just keeps coming back to their site, and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights, and they decide, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours. They're getting cold. They're super tired. The woman's nowhere to be found. And so they finally say, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning, when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug, that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep, is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows, and as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. There is nothing quite as satisfying as a true story that's mysterious and interesting, it sucked you in, that has a killer plot twist, a killer reveal. That to me is just the most satisfying thing you can find. I am a complete story addict, and so I go looking for these stories. I go literally searching for real life stories with real life plot twists. And in my opinion, the very best one is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers, and that is the story I'm going to tell today. So the too long didn't read version of this story is a crew is sent out to this lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They're being sent out there to relieve the workers that are there, provide new supplies, and just kind of make sure everything is okay. When they get out there, nothing is okay. The 3 lighthouse keepers are missing. The island and the lighthouse are kind of in disarray, and then they find the lighthouse keeper's logbook, which, needless to say, is very strange. It has some entries in it that don't really add up, and then when you combine those entries with what some people had to say on the mainland that were watching the island, it really doesn't add up. So it creates this really epic plot twist. It's absolutely worth watching to the end, I promise. So let's get there. Off the coast of northwestern Scotland lies a stretch of 7 small islands. It's called the Flannan Isles. One of those isles is called Eilean Moor, and on Eilean Moor is a lighthouse, and that's where our story is going to be centered. But before we get into the story, Eilean Moor has some odd history to it. It's long been regarded as a place that's paranormal. In fact, on the island, basically, the only people that inhabit it are the lighthouse keepers. Usually there's 3 or 4 of them, and sheep. And so sheep herders often go out to that island, and they're the ones that report hearing strange sounds and just feeling like they're being watched. It's a creepy place. And in fact, anybody that visits the island that isn't a sheep herder or a lighthouse keeper, even if they've never heard of the history of Eilean Moor, oftentimes report a very odd sense of being watched, of just not feeling right on that island. And so Eilean Moor really had developed a reputation as being a pretty creepy place. So in addition to just the strange aura around the island that basically anyone who went there reported, anybody that went to the Church of St. Flannan is its name, they reported feeling like they were being drawn to pray. That there was this overwhelming sense that you should be praying as soon as you walk into the church. And in fact, the draw was so strong, like getting on your knees and praying, that they developed this strange ritual that when you got to the island, it was customary that before you went in, you immediately dropped to your knees and crawled around the church on your knees before making your way inside and continuing to pray. So just a strange place with strange rituals. That's the scene that is set for this true life, very strange mystery. In December of 1900, a steamboat was passing by the Flannan Isles, and as they rounded their way past Eilean Moor, they noticed that the light was out. The lighthouse was not operational. And so when that steamboat finally got to port 3 days later, they told authorities that, hey, Eilean Moor is not operational. You should go check on them. And so as it happened, it was actually time to replace the lighthouse keepers that were at Eilean Moor. So Captain James Harvey gets his crew together, and he takes Joseph Moore, who's the replacement lighthouse keeper, and they head out to Eilean Moor to check on the lighthouse, check on the lighthouse keepers, but also replace them. So it was a changing of the guard and making sure that everything was okay. As you approach Eilean Moor, you would see a massive staircase coming up from the dock all the way up to where the lighthouse is. So from a distance, if you were looking at Eilean Moor, it would be fairly easy to break out anybody that was walking down the steps to get down to the dock. And since the island was really only inhabited by lighthouse keepers and sheep, the crew, Captain Harvey and his crew, as they're making their approach to Eileen Moore, they're watching those steps to see if the lighthouse keepers are going to notice them and come down and greet them on the dock, because that was customary. You always are at the dock ready to assist the crew as they come into Eileen Moore. That was just the way it was done. And so as they're making their approach, they're watching these steps, looking for signs that the keepers are coming down, because on some level, the crew that's going out to replace them, on the back of their head, they're a little bit nervous that something's wrong. I mean, they know that the lighthouse was not operational, and that's part of the reason they're going out. So they're kind of like actively watching those steps. They're looking for signs that they're coming down to the dock. And as they get closer and closer, they don't see anybody come down the steps. They don't see anyone on the dock. And even worse, no preparations were made for the next crew to come into the dock. That was something that all lighthouse keepers did. They kept that dock, up to code so that if any time someone came in, they could properly dock and make their way up. So no preparations are made. No one is coming down to greet them. So the omen is pretty bad. And so Captain Harvey and his crew, they dock on the dock, and the captain and his crew say, hey, to Joseph Moore, you go up and just do a cursory examination of the island. Make sure these guys are okay. We'll stay down here for a minute. You go check. So Joseph Moore gets out and he starts walking up this massive set of stairs where he can't see the lighthouse. He can only see the steps. It's pretty steep. And later he would say that he had this deep sense of just foreboding, like something bad is about to happen. He felt very stressed out as he's walking up these stairs. And as he makes his way up, he finally kind of crests to where he can actually start to break out the top of the island where you can see the lighthouse and you can see, where they were staying. And the first thing he notices is the steel railings that line this massive staircase up to the island near the lighthouse itself. The steel railings had been bent over. Like, imagine if it was made out of tinfoil. They had been folded onto themselves. Like, pretty significant damage to, steel railings. And so he makes note of that. And he also notices that this big boulder that just, I don't think it was decorative. It just was on the island. And so they built around it. There's this huge boulder that just was right in front of the lighthouse. And it had been that way for, years and years. It had moved significantly. And you could actually see a trail underneath the boulder where it had rolled across the grass. So Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper, is thinking to himself, my God, this is straight out of the storm of the century. Like, clearly the worst storm ever has hit this island. No wonder their lighthouse was non-operational, because they were hit with like the worst storm ever. And so that's his initial assessment. He goes up to the door. The door is unlocked, but shut. And he opens it up. First thing he does is he yells for the lighthouse keepers that are supposed to be there. They don't call back. There's apparently no one in the lighthouse. Before he even starts moving through the lighthouse, he looks on his right and he sees all the hooks where they would have kept their clothes. And one hook still is holding an oilskin jacket. And anytime you would leave the lighthouse, especially if you were leaving the island for some reason, there is no reason in the world you would not be wearing that jacket. So it's another kind of bad sign. It means that if they're not here, if the three lighthouse keepers are not inside of this lighthouse, why aren't all three oilskins gone with them? It's another sign that something terrible has happened. He looks into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table is plates of meat. There is, pickles that have just been pulled out of a jar, and a couple of the chairs have been upturned. And he also noticed that the mechanical clocks had stopped. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, something happened where they left in a hurry because they toppled over chairs, they left food on the table, someone forgot their jacket. He continues moving through the lighthouse and he gets to their bedrooms, and all of their beds are unmade. Again, it was kind of customary that you would never leave the lighthouse unmade. You would make your bed because someone else could be coming in to relieve you. And so it was yet another sign to Joseph Moore that something had happened suddenly that caused the lighthouse keepers to abandon the lighthouse. Combining that with the massive damage from the storm, he's starting to think, something happened, this horrible storm is coming through. Like maybe it got really bad really quickly and they didn't have time to make proper preparations. They didn't have time to do the things that were customary. They just had to kind of boogie out of there. So Joseph Moore returns to Captain Harvey and says, "This is what I saw." And so Captain Harvey and the crew go back up and they kind of see it for themselves. And Captain Harvey ends up sending a telegram back to the mainland explaining that there has been a horrible tragedy here. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The three keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. After Captain Harvey sends this telegram, he and Joseph Moore and the rest of the crew continue to kind of search the island and do some investigating. And they discover the logbook that the three lighthouse keepers had been keeping. And so all of the entries are pretty standard. It was, common practice that you would mark down what happened that day, what ships you saw, just kind of basic log keeping of the lighthouse. But they start getting really interesting on December 12th. On December 12th, the leader of the three lighthouse keepers noted that severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen before, he's been doing this for decades, are passing through the island. And he's acting pretty worried about whether or not the lighthouse will be able to withstand this storm. He also noted that the other two lighthouse keepers were not doing well. He said one of them had been basically just praying nonstop. The other had been doing a bit of crying. Now, the man he's describing that is crying over the intensity of the storm was known on the mainland as one of the toughest, saltiest men on the planet, who had weathered dozens of hurricanes out on islands all by himself. And so for him to be crying over the severity of the storm just shows you how severe the storm really was. The entries on the 13th and 14th point to them believing that they're not going to get out of the storm alive. At this point, all three of them are just praying nonstop and are kind of anticipating at some point they're just going to get swept off the island. Then on December 15th, it just says, "Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all." So Robert Moorhead, who is one of the leaders of the investigation, said that basically on December 15th, after that final entry was made, they must have gone down to the dock to secure some of the supplies and just kind of make sure that it wasn't totally damaged from all of the storm, and a rogue wave from this storm must have swept them away. When word got to the Scottish mainland about what had happened to these lighthouse keepers, the people that sat on the coast facing Eilean Moor, they were really confused, because whenever there's a storm out at Eilean Moor, they can see it because the island's not that far off the coast and they can see the storm. But over the past few days, namely December 12th to the 15th, which was the time period those log entries were made about the storm passing through, the people on the mainland of Scotland said that not only was there no storm, but in fact, the visibility onto Eilean Moor was better than it had been in years. They saw parts of the island that were only visible in perfect circumstances, meaning there was never any storm. So what the heck happened to those lighthouse keepers? What were those log entries about? Why were they drawn to tears? How did the railings get flipped over and the boulder get moved aside? Where did they go? In the years following their disappearance, other keepers were sent out to man that lighthouse, and all of them reported hearing someone yelling the names of the three lighthouse keepers that went missing. So pretty creepy stuff. And unfortunately, it's still very much an unsolved mystery, despite the official statement by Robert Moorhead. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think might have happened to the lighthouse keepers, and what could possibly explain that there wasn't a storm, but in the journal they said it was the worst storm ever, and there's physical damage done to the island. How do we reconcile that? Either someone's not telling the truth, or something just doesn't add up. And I'd love to hear what you have to say. Many people have claimed over the years to have been abducted by aliens. And realistically, there's no tangible evidence that any human being has ever actually set foot in an extraterrestrial spacecraft or another dimension or anything like that. It's just these crazy stories from people that claim this happened to them. And while many of these stories are very quickly cast aside as absolute hoax, not true, not accurate, there's one story one abduction story that is universally regarded as the most believable and most famous alien abduction story, and that is of Travis Walton. What made this case so famous is that unlike all of the other alien abduction cases where there was never any proof, it was usually one person's first-hand account. In this case, you have a full-scale police investigation. You have up to 16 lie detector tests that were taken by Travis Walton himself, along with the other witnesses and people that were there. And you have a group of 6 level-headed guys that actually witnessed the abduction take place and have stuck to their story and have passed all lie detector tests and have never changed their story in 40 years. And you would think that at some point you might change your story because they came under incredible scrutiny. I mean, it basically derailed most of their careers and their lives because they were labeled as crazy people for believing that a UFO had abducted Travis Walton. I mean, in a way, they became famous, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these elements that make this story seem fairly credible. And even if this wasn't an alien abduction, let's say, how do you account for the past lie detector tests that are talking about UFOs? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was really missing for 5 days and has no idea where he was? And there was a full search effort to find him in the area where he would have been. So lots of unanswered questions, but the story itself of when he was actually abducted, and then his own story about what happened once he had been abducted, it makes for just an incredible story. It's been converted into books and movies, and to this day, it remains one of, if not the single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 of these stories every week. So if that's something that interests you, I would encourage you to gently extirpate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive into the story. By 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had developed a bad boy reputation in his hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. You know, he rode a noisy Harley Davidson motorcycle through town. He was a wild bull rider and he was a boxer. And there was a story about Travis when he was with his friends in a car and they were driving down this road and a bear jumped out of the woods and landed in the middle of the road and was just standing there. And Travis, without any hesitation, leaps out of his car and chases after this huge bear and scares it into the woods, and in fact chased it up into the woods. So Travis was just known as this kind of rebel, problem child a little bit, but he was beloved by his friends. He was just like one of those cool guys that he did it his own way. So Travis and the 6 other men that he worked with were loggers. They were given contracts and they would go out and they would clear trees in a certain area. They were not big time with huge equipment to do this. We're talking chainsaws, regular saws and axes. And they would just go out, these blue collar, like hard working type guys, and they would clear areas of trees. That's what they did. Now, these 7 men, they did a dangerous job. I mean, you're cutting down these huge trees and you're usually working pretty quickly. You're operating, chainsaws that are pretty dangerous. And Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss, who was there the day of this event, he described in a number of his interviews that, the men that he hired to do these jobs, they needed to be incredibly level-headed. They did not strike you as people that would have this fantastical, alien encounter story. On November 5th, 1975, Mike Rogers was given a contract to clear out this huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. And he grabbed his crew, they piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and Mike knew that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a huge area to cover, and he told his men up front, we're going to be working really, really hard, so expect long, full days. And so over the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working, long, long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were behind schedule. At the end of this 3rd day, it's late at night, they've worked all day and everybody is just totally exhausted. And so finally they wrap up and they all pile back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they start driving the access road back down to the main road to get back to the town. And as they're driving, they're not really talking about work at all. They're kind of joking about what they're going to do that night. And as they're driving down the road, and again, it's heavily forested, they look off to the right, and there is some lights in the forest. They would say in interviews that they all noticed it, but it did not stand out as anything particularly bad. It just could be anything. They weren't thinking about it. But as they were driving down this road and this light, I guess, got brighter, or maybe they couldn't help but notice it, they all started commenting on this light, and they're looking at it, and somebody suggested that, oh, it's probably just the moon. It's a full moon. But then one of the guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his side, away from where that light was, and he goes, no, the moon's over here. It's on this side of the road. So they're like, okay, it's not the moon. And then someone suggested, oh, well, maybe it's a forest fire. Like, maybe we should go check it out. That could be a forest fire. But then Mike Rogers, the driver, the crew boss, was like, no, there'd be smoke. There's no smoke or anything. And Travis, who, he's the guy that's jumping out of cars to go chase down bears, and he's like a total kind of adrenaline junkie type. He's like, hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. Like, I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out. The guys in the truck were a little on edge about it, but ultimately said, what's the harm? We'll drive over. We know there's a road that brings us over to that section of the forest. We'll get a look at whatever this is, and then we'll leave. So they drive down this other little access road, and they come to a clearing where these lights were, and they are astounded at what they see. They were all polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. Each of them described the same thing with slightly different details because it's from their own perspective. And the polygraph tests all showed that they were telling the truth. They saw this disc-shaped craft with what looked like panels of lights on the underside, hovering in a clearing, maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground, not spinning or anything, just floating in midair, as if it was suspended. And the men, in their interviews later on TV shows and books, they would say what struck them was not just the fact that there's this craft here, but how bizarre it was to see this thing defying gravity. It's not moving, but it's hovering over the air, and it's right in front of us. And one of the men even commented at length, because he would build houses, and he was a handy guy. And he started talking about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was really impressive engineering on the underside of this craft. It was just this beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're looking at it, and Travis is so excited when they get to this clearing. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, but much like the bear, where he jumps out and chases the bear, as soon as they were almost at a stop in this clearing right next to the ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else is, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the car towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. The craft is maybe from where they parked, maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then 50 or 100 feet in the air. And the crew doesn't say anything. They're just dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards the ship. And he would say in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one knew what it was. Some sort of craft. They didn't know what it was, but it was fascinating to him, and he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object in the sky, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They had this bad sense that something was going to happen, and they thought, you shouldn't go near it, like, come back. Not to mention, it's hovering in the air. What if it falls and it lands on you? Like, hey, Travis, come back over here. And then it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And so Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to come back to the car. But he's not really paying any attention. He's still walking. And finally he stops. He's just looking at it. And Travis would say he was just struck at just the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. And he's looking at it, and then all of a sudden it starts spinning. Just a little bit. And it starts emitting this noise that all of them reported hearing, this loud mechanical sound. And now the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder. And Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds. And he was about to turn and go back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out and strikes Travis like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown 20 feet away. Like he gets lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet. And they watched it happen. And again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the same thing. All passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, knocked him 20 feet back. Mike Rogers, in a panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decide to leave. And they're convincing themselves, as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're convincing themselves that he's dead already. We just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. And they're freaked out. They don't even know what they saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving a little ways until finally Mike just hits the brakes and he stops. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He was like, if you guys want to stay here and wait for me, that's fine. But this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than going back. They wanted to stay together. So a little bit begrudgingly, although they knew they needed to, they all got back in the truck, turned around and started driving back up to the UFO site. As they make it back up, they notice that there is no lights up there. The craft is gone and there's no Travis. And they get out, and now Mike is uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned him, and where did he go? Everybody else is in shock. They can't believe it. They start screaming for Travis. They're running around the woods, yelling for Travis, looking for signs of Travis. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not here. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew that it was going to be bad for them when they told police. The story is a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone. That doesn't really sit well with police. But they knew, because they wanted to find Travis and they were very concerned about their friend, they knew they had to tell police. Mike and a few of the other crew were just unable to even think. They were crying, they were upset. And so finally they get to a payphone, the first payphone they saw, because this is 1975. And Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just very simple guy, very level-headed guy. He decides to call the police because he's the only one who was, I guess, composed enough to do it. And so he calls the sheriff's department and he says, you got to come out here. We can't find our friend Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice, but he's gone and we don't know where he went. So shortly thereafter, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Ken Copeland, their partners, they show up at this rest stop where this payphone was, and they get to the scene. They see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The crew has now gotten out of the truck. They look distraught for sure. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said UFO, he hasn't said aliens, he's just said, we were up at the logging site, we had a contract up there, and then, just, it's hard to describe, and Mike Rogers jumps in, he's like, we saw a UFO, and a ray of light hit Travis, and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are looking at them like, really? And so they stopped them and were like, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And they're like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, nothing. They check each of them to see if they're sober, and their field test showed they were all sober. And the Sheriff Gillespie, who was the overall in charge sheriff, even though he was a total skeptic, and so was Sheriff Copeland as well, he would say about that first engagement with the 6 crew members that they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened. They don't know what it was, but they were shaken up. And what Sheriff Gillespie believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton and they were using a UFO to cover it up. But he also was thinking to himself, like, this is a bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories really lined up particularly well. They're not doing a good job explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple hours later, the sun's starting to come up because it was super late when all this happened. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. And the crew members, they're all there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up and they are scouring the area. I mean, they got dogs out, they got these huge teams looking everywhere, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign, there's nothing. There's nothing from Travis. And so while this is all going on, Sheriff Copeland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and being like, hey, If you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, like, we'll go easy on you guys. Like, we know you did it. And they can feel that the pressure is really mounting, that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions, because that's the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you, because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony. That's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're starting to see that, like, they're going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they noticed during the search, this first day of searching, that these 3 guys wearing red jackets had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation that they would have people come out that were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was naive to think that the police would actually do that. But he thought, given the fact that we've all said this is a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that seem like a metal detector, and his gut says they're paranormal investigators. And so Mike goes over to them and he's like, hey, what are these tools you guys are doing? Like, what is this? And they look at him and they're like, oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area. And he asked them, like, well, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department? And they just didn't really answer him. They said, oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do. And Mike sees an opportunity, because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then, evaporated him or something, they were within range of that big ball of lightning, and they were very much in the kind of cone where, had there been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets on and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, and there's nothing. There's no trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, no, there's nothing. And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until this search, they had the crew gone home and changed, then come out to do the search. And so he thought, well, then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here, but we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets, and the guy in red scans his helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red, like, looked up at Mike and looked down at the helmet, and he's scanning it, and he's looking at him, like, kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other 2 in red and tells them to stop doing what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then, without any indication of what the results were, what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell them what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, okay. And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, well, wait, what does this mean? And they don't turn around, and they just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are like trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving, and then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs, who they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends, but they figured we need to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, hey, who are those guys in red jackets with the radiation detectors? And Sheriff Gillespie's like, who? There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone here is here because I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they? And he's like, well, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there. And Sheriff Gillespie's like, well, I didn't order them there. And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these 3 people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people if they had interacted with them, and no one knew. So after this search that goes on for a couple of days, turns up nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis, that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they harmed Travis, and they were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff department, they really perpetuated that. They were pretty open about, this is not a UFO situation. This is not an alien abduction. This is a missing person case. And frankly, we believe the UFO thing is a hoax. national and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. And news media outlets are converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they're inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about this alien abduction. And it's really frustrating the two sheriffs who are leading this investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copland. And they were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members, this hoax, right? That's what they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copland decide, you know what? We're going to just cut through all the BS here, and we're going to make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours, same questions, all centering on the criminal side, the kind of foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, it was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying. It just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner had anywhere from a 92 to 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the country. And he even would say, like, it would be so difficult to fake that. To have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax and they harmed Travis Walton. It would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff, and Sheriff Gillespie is dumbfounded because he believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just be a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now the examiner is saying they're telling the truth. And so Detective Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road and he didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's laying, he kind of turns his head to look up into the sky and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship, because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the kind of engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it flies into the sky and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. And he remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated. And he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him because he was so weak and he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters the strength to stand up and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead there is a rest stop. And at rest stops, there's payphones. And he makes his way down and he goes to the payphone and he has change in his pocket still. He puts it in the payphone and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother he can't believe he's talking to Travis because Travis is probably supposed to be dead at this point. He didn't believe it was Travis, but Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after, the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. This is like he's coming to and he's like, man, what happened? Like I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship and now I'm over here. Like, what am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days. And Travis, who was kind of almost catatonic, he's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, what do you mean days? And his brother's like, you've been missing for 5 days. And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly. And his brother's looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked a couple times what happened and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. And I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asks the doctors to be discreet. and he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he'd been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and, you know, he was malnourished and he was tired and looked very sick. But there was no physical wounds, with the exception of he had one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was, you know, a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site, and they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there was no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix, Arizona. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. It had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, Arizona, and they are nonstop calling Travis's brother. Like, hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him. Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentions seeing this thing in a clearing. You know, he gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was. And then, you know, he's on the road 5 days later, and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over the 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of doesn't really give up. He's like, well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything. And so he just said, we're going to be in touch. And he drives back. And then media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody found out, because this was a huge story, where he was, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here, we'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him. And so they agree to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there looking at the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days. Because initially all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking up to this craft. And he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made. And before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings, and he's kind of in and out of consciousness, and he's, you know, this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals, and he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me, and my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and he's in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this almost like rock sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals. And this person is working on this box, and then the person looks at Travis Walton and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton, and Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him, and its eyes were like slits, and it's looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him. He kind of topples off of this table that he was on, and he realizes he's in a fairly small room. And there's 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just laying on. He didn't know what it was. And he starts kind of wildly waving it at them and screaming to leave him alone, like, get away from me. And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And the three figures in lab coats start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him and he's waving and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down the little, outside the door, down the little hallway, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room, and it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said, like, the room, it was like this perfectly flat. Everything was flat and smooth. There was no door handles. Couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there's some buttons on the chair itself. And he pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a person, a man, appears in the doorway who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved, even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high. But he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's like in panic mode now. He sees another human being and he runs over to him and he says, please, you got to help me. I don't know where I am. You know, where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man who at least looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off. Like they weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were like permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, like, where are we? And the guy takes him by the arm and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from and continued down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction. And they get to another door and he opens it up and Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him. And he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit's just not reacting to him. They open this door and they go down into this huge hangar where there's all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing, that Travis saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit's saying nothing, and Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? Saying nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar, and they open up another door, and they go into this bright white room. And there's three more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table, and they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door they came in through. Travis goes in and he sees these three and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the three other people, and they pick him up and they put him on the table. And he starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He's like, what are you doing? And they force him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask and they put it over his face. And then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to run down to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. He was talking to press. He was, doing interviews. The police wanted to talk to him. There's a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members. And they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house, and they just said, you got to tell us what happened. And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of this story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken, but they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson, his interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now. And he says, to this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship. And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is, the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is most people think it's a hoax. One of them, like his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story. They don't believe him. So if this was a hoax, like to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken, 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew, and they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested, the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear, and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They gotta fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, the primary criticism of virtually every paranormal story out there is a lack of credibility. Either the person claiming the events happened lacks credibility themselves, Or you just don't have any other corroborating evidence, like other people that witnessed it, other credible people that witnessed it, or in many cases, a lack of video or photo proof that said paranormal event happened. But in the case of the story today, you not only have a highly credible witness, a NASA robotics engineer, you also have other corroborating witnesses that are from that NASA engineer's family that were there and witnessed it with him. And you have, albeit limited, you do have video footage of what they are claiming happened that was paranormal. But before we get into all of that in today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's your thing, if you could gently pulverize the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my uploads every week. All right, let's get into it. Bill Vale has always been incredibly scientifically minded. He's always had technical jobs his whole life. He took a job for 15 years at NASA as a robotics engineer. He also spent a little time as a pilot for NASA as well. He is just somebody that is very process oriented. And in fact, his family and friends, they say this with respect, but they say that, Bill, he lacks an imagination. He's super pragmatic, super to the point, and doesn't really have time for, call it creativity. He's all about facts. In 2002, Bill and his wife separate, and it catches Bill a little bit off guard. And it almost prompts like a midlife crisis for him where, before it had been really his work with NASA that had been fulfilling to him. And now he has this huge gap in his life. And suddenly, he's looking around and he's like, what am I doing all this for? I don't have a family anymore. Like, what am I doing? And so he decides to move back home to Arlington, Texas, where his little brother lived. So when he gets to Arlington, he feels like he can have a fresh start in a way. He has family around, so he doesn't feel quite as lonely. And he actually just takes a job at his brother's water purification company because he wasn't sure what he was going to do. He just knew that he needed to do something. So he gets a job at this water purification company and he starts working with his brother. And he finds that even though it's not the same type of work that he was doing as a robotics engineer at NASA, it was nice to be working day in and day out with a family member. So Bill has only been living in Arlington for just a couple of months, and he had only been at the water purification company for maybe a couple of weeks. And so when a Saturday house call was called into the company and no one really wanted to do it, Bill thought, you know what, I'll take one for the team, make a good impression on my coworkers, and I'll take the house call. And what it involved is part of Bill's job was to go demonstrate how to install and use this water purification system in customers' home. The dispatcher for the water purification company said to Bill, she goes, hey, listen, this is a little bit weird, but the person who called was adamant that you be there at 5 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. And it was probably only about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he's like, so what do I do? And she's like, I don't know, like go get a bite to eat and just make sure you're there by 5. And so he does that. He's like, that's weird. But he drives around and he parks outside of the house a little ways down the street. And a couple minutes before 5, he gets out and he starts heading over to the property to do this house call. He starts walking up the path to this big brick house at like 4:59. And as he's getting closer to the steps, he can hear through the front door, which he can already tell it's slightly open. It's not latched all the way. He can hear screaming inside of this house. It sounds like a woman screaming, and it actually sounds like she's screaming, get out of here. But he doesn't really know what to make of it. He has a job to do, so he walks up to the door, and even though it's open, he knocks. And now he can literally hear through the crack in the door that someone in this house is screaming. And he's listening, and finally he decides, well, I should probably just open it up and make sure everything's okay, because I can hear someone screaming inside, the door's open. So he opens it up and he walks inside. He takes one step inside of the residence and just kind of peeks around, and he can see a little bit down the hall off to the right, there's an opening to a room. And in the room are 3 men on their knees in a little circle, and a woman is walking around them in a circle, and she's holding a book in her hand, and she's speaking in tongues. Just nonsensical, couldn't make sense of her language, but periodically as she's circling them and she's touching each of their heads, she's screaming, get out of here. leave these people, get out of here. Bill is about to leave. He knows that this is just too weird for him, but right before he does, the woman who's walking around the three men on the ground looks up at him and points directly at him and doesn't break eye contact and just holds her finger out pointing at him. And he gets this very strange sense that like this woman wants to do harm to him. And so he just runs out the door and is like, yeah, I'm not going back in there. Goes back to his car and he calls the dispatcher back at the water purification company. And he's like, okay, I just took an insane house call. The lady in there is crazy. I'm not doing it. Don't reschedule. And if you do not put me on it because I will not go in there. Bill was a very straightforward guy. And he's just not going to let his imagination run wild with what they were doing. You know, those people are crazy and that's not my business. It's not my problem. And so he forgot about it. He just goes home to his house and he turns on the TV and he gets his microwave dinner and he's just sitting there eating his food and just having a nice Saturday night to himself when out of the corner of his eye in his other room, and I keep in mind, Bill lives alone and has no pets. Out of the corner of his eye, he thinks he sees something small dart across the ground. He couldn't tell if it was flying through the room or if it was running through the room, but he just was like, oh, now I got, some rodent or a bird or something in my house. It must have snuck in through the chimney. And so Bill is not scared. He's mostly like frustrated that now he has to deal with some rodent in his house or some bird in his house. So he puts his food down and he turns on all the lights because he was watching TV with the lights off, turns on all the lights and just searches his house. He's like quiet, listening, trying to like hear where the thing went in his house. And he can't hear anything. And after over an hour, he just decides, well, geez, I don't know where it went. I don't know what it was. Maybe I didn't even see it in the first place. So that night, he wakes up suddenly to what feels like some small creature running over the foot of his bed, but like over his foot. And it instantly wakes him up and he instinctively sucks his legs up to his chest under his covers. As pretty much anybody would do when some random creature is running on your feet in the middle of the night. And he's like, great, this thing, it's probably, now you can tell it's a rat, it's a rodent. He's like, great, now it's literally in my bedroom on my bed. And so he flips on the lights and now he's just mad because this is right in the middle of the night. It's the last thing he needs. And he lights on and he searches the room. He looks under, his dresser. He looks in the closet. He looks under his bed. He looks everywhere. And he can't find this thing. He's stopping periodically to listen and he can't hear scurrying or anything. Did I imagine that as well? Because I guess I don't know if I saw something darting out of the corner of my eye when I was watching TV. I think I did. And just now, could that have been in my dream? Because he wasn't really awake for it happening. He woke up to it and thought it's what happened. And so he's starting to like tell himself that, you know what? I'm somehow creating this weird thought in my head. Like I probably didn't see anything downstairs and I was probably having a dream about this, rodent in my house. And that's what prompted the thought that something had touched my feet. And so he's like, all right, whatever. Turns off his lights and he goes back to bed. So Bill falls back asleep, but shortly thereafter, he wakes up again when his bed is violently shaking. And he wakes up and his bed's shaking and it stops almost immediately once he's awake. And he thinks that they're having an earthquake. So he jumps out of his bed and he's looking around to see if like things are going to start falling on him. He runs to the window. He looks outside. He can't tell what's going on. He runs into the other room and he can suddenly tell, because he's in a bit of a panic, that there is no more shaking happening. Now the shaking's done. The house is totally silent. And he runs back to his bed and he has this thought like, could I in my sleep have shaken my bed? And he had one of those huge 4-poster beds and he's like trying to move it. And Bill's a big, strong guy and he can barely move his bed. And he has this memory of my bed was literally shaking. And he's like, now this is 3 times that something strange has happened. And I can't make sense of it. And being a very kind of pragmatic person and not one with, as his family said, a wild imagination, he did not have that. He's like, okay, let's find out if there was an earthquake. So he goes online and he starts researching earthquakes. And he's thinking maybe if the earthquake had just happened, that the news would break right then and there, some headline. There's nothing. And so he's like, okay, what other rational things could have caused my house to shake? Because again, there's no other damage in his house. Nothing fell. It was just, he felt the shaking and that was it. And so he starts researching like what's in the area. And he finds that there was a military base, and actually it's an air base right near his house, a couple miles away. And he's thinking, okay, well, when the fighter jets are taking off, that take off at all hours, maybe there's a sonic boom from one of the jets accelerating. And he didn't know if that was it, but he thought it could be it. And then he's like, oh, well, there's also all these oil rigs that are drilling in the area. Maybe there was an accident. So he's researching for, recent accidents at oil rigs. And he's trying to find a rational explanation for this bed shaking incident. He also can't help but feel like, what happened with that thing I saw that was like touching my feet? Like, he's not connecting the two events, but he has this weird sense that either something's wrong with him and he's losing his mind, or something really weird is happening in his property. So as he's trying to find this rational explanation, his internet goes out. And so he tries troubleshooting it a couple times, but he can't get it to work. And so he calls his service provider to just have them see if they can fix it. And so he calls customer service, somebody picks up, and they're like, yep, your internet's out, let me fix it for you. Let me put you on a brief hold. And so they put him on hold, and as he's sitting there, like listening to elevator music, like staticky sounds started coming through the receiver, and he's just noticing it. It's nothing significant. But then a voice comes into the phone that is speaking in tongues, like nonsensical language, and it sounds almost threatening. At some point, Bill is just totally unsettled by this voice because it's just going on and on. He's been on hold now for like 2 minutes of this weird voice. He just hangs up. And like in just a couple of seconds, he gets a call back from the same customer service rep that he had just been speaking to. And he had an accent, and Bill picked up on it and said, hey, was I just talking to you? And the customer service rep was like, yes, sorry, we got disconnected. And Bill says, did you hear that voice? Did you hear that strange voice on the phone? And the customer service rep, who's mostly operates on a bit of a script, kind of deviates for a second and says, actually, yes, I did hear that. And I was actually trying to figure out how that could have been possible, because we use a very secure phone line when we talk to our customers, and there's really no way for someone to actually block my ability to speak to you. Like, even if someone was on the call, you would still be able to hear me, and I was trying to yell to you and you weren't hearing me. So I don't know how that would have happened. But I definitely heard the voice. I don't know what that was, and we're so sorry. So both of them are definitely weirded out by it, but the customer service rep, he's got a job to do, and he's like, hey, your internet works again, thanks, talk to you soon. He hangs up. And Bill's left with his internet working again, but now that's the fourth strange thing. He has the thing that runs across the room as he's watching TV. He has the thing that ran across his feet at night. He has his bed shaking, and now he has this like devil voice speaking in tongues on the phone that the customer service rep also heard and couldn't make sense of. He decides to, I'm done doing research for the night. It's, 3 a.m. or whatever it was. I'm going to just try to get a couple hours of sleep because this is just starting to freak me out a little bit. So Bill gets back in his bed and he's trying to sleep, but he can't stop thinking about the fact that there have been 4 strange occurrences in the span of just a couple of hours. And he can't help himself but start to feel a little bit worried that something that he doesn't understand is going on. Something bad is going on. And as he's sitting there desperately trying to sleep, he swears he can hear some sort of sound underneath his bed. He knows it could be his mind playing tricks on him, but it doesn't matter. He thinks he hears it, and it's now he's officially spooked. Like a child, he pulls the covers over his head. And he's just laying on his bed with the covers over his head, just basically trying to convince himself, like, this isn't happening. There isn't anything under your bed. Just relax. Nothing's happening. He's got his legs sucked up, up near his chest. He's just under his sheets. And the way he was positioned is he had left a light on in his room, and there was a light basically beaming down onto the sheet that was over the upper part of his body. So there's a little bit of light into the cavern under his sheets. And so he's holding it up over his head. And as he's sitting there, like trying to tell himself that nothing's going on, he looks down towards the foot of his bed, under his covers, right? And he sees a hand slowly reaching up from the side of the bed, come up and try to grab his foot. And it just misses and then retracts out from under the bed. Bill literally leaps out of bed, flips on every light, and is now in just absolute crisis mode. He immediately is like up against the wall, doesn't even want to look under the bed, but eventually he does. He kind of pokes under, nothing's down there. He looks around his room, there's no sign of anybody in the room, and now it's like, okay, you've had so many strange occurrences, and none of it makes sense. Like, what are you going to do? And he had no idea. So Bill does not attempt to go back to bed that night. He goes downstairs, flips on every light in his house, starts drinking coffee like he's awake. He's like, I'm not doing this tonight. And so he stays up the rest of the night. So the next day, Bill just tries to have a normal day. He doesn't want to think about what happened the night before. So he goes to work like normal, doesn't tell anybody about it. Again, Bill, he's a straight shooter. He's not about to be, the former NASA robotics engineer that's like, hey, let me tell you about the paranormal stuff that's happening in my house. He's doing everything he can to not think like that. And so by the end of the day, he started to feel a little bit of anxiety as he's getting ready to go back to his house, because he would have to potentially face some of the strange things that happened the night before. They could happen again tonight. And so he gets home, has all his lights on. He's not about to keep his lights off. And he's sitting in his chair. He always sits in the same one where he was watching TV and saw that thing dart across the room. He's sitting there and he's eating his microwave dinner and he's watching TV. Again, all the lights on in his house. And he looks down for a minute to get another bite of food. And when he looks up, a bottle is zinging towards him. And he moves his head out of the way and it hits the wall beside him and it breaks. It's a glass bottle and shatters on the ground. And then all the lights in the house go out. So Bill runs to the closet where he knows he has a flashlight. He opens it up, reaches for the flashlight, and as he's about to pull it out, he hears in the closet, towards the top of the closet, this loud slamming sound. And he had a couple pretty heavy boxes on the very top shelf in his closet, and it sounded like someone had almost lifted one up and then slammed it down on the top shelf. But obviously he didn't do that, and it totally freaked him out. He grabs the flashlight, shines it in the closet. There's no one in there. There's nothing in there. And he backs out. And then the lights come back on and his heart's racing because he knows what just happened. Someone just threw a bottle at his head. Someone just slammed something in his closet and he's in full panic mode. And so the only person he can think to call is his brother because he's not prepared to go to the police because the things he would need to describe are kind of nonsensical sounding. But his brother, who's very rational, equally kind of pragmatic in his approach to everything. He calls his brother and he's like, get over here. I got some weird stuff happening in my house and I just need a sanity check. And so his brother, Bob, his younger brother, Bob, he comes over. And as soon as Bob gets there, Bill is like, he had never had a discussion about the paranormal with his brother before. So he's just like, all right, this is going to sound weird, but Bob, I need you to just go in this closet and just go in the closet. And Bob's like, what in the world are you talking about? And Bill's like, please, just go in there. I'm going to shut the door and I want you to just tell me what happens. And so Bob's like, all right. Bob goes in the closet. Bill shuts the door behind him. Bill's just out there waiting. And Bill calls to Bob, hey, turn off the light. There's a little pull string, little tiny light bulb. Turn off the light in there. So, Bob's like, all right, turns off the light and it's pitch black in there. And so at the time, Bob would not tell Bill what happened to him in the closet. Mostly because if you put yourself in Bob's position, he doesn't have any of the context. He doesn't have anything that happened. He's never experienced anything like this before. And so what he experiences, he kind of chalks up to probably his own doing. He doesn't think that someone did it to him. And so what happens is he's in the closet and he feels something hit his leg. And he thinks, oh, I must have knocked into something that hit my leg, like a pair of shoes or something. And he's just standing there. And then something hits him hard in the face. And he thinks, oh, I must have hit something on the top shelf that fell and hit me in the head. But the two things combined, it did unsettle him a little bit. And he consciously decided, I'm not going to tell my brother Bill that this happened because I'll only feed into his own paranoia right now. And that's not what he needs. Opens the closet, gets out, and he's like, you know what, Bill? Nothing happened in there. You got nothing to worry about. There's nothing in here. And so he leaves, and Bill is left kind of crestfallen because he feels like he really didn't do a good job conveying to his brother just how much had happened in the house so far. He basically said, I've heard some strange noises, go in the closet. And then nothing really happened. So he feels like out of his element. He just feels like he doesn't know how to handle it. And so he has only one other person that he feels comfortable kind of letting in to this situation because it was just kind of embarrassing for Bill. I mean, he's this esteemed NASA employee. The last thing he wants is to have somebody think that he's like losing his mind a little bit. But he has his friend Michael, who is a sound engineer that worked for a couple podcasts. And when he calls him, Bill doesn't even really know what he's going to say to Michael. He just needed to talk to someone, like a friendly voice kind of thing. And he calls him, and Michael's a little bit surprised to see Bill calling him, and they have a little bit of small talk. And Bill says to Michael, I don't know how to approach this with you, but I moved to Arlington, and I got some weird stuff going on in my house, and I guess I'm just telling you because I don't know what else to do. And so Michael's like a little bit caught off guard. and is a little bit just worried about his friend. And he starts asking him some basic questions, just, oh, well, what have you heard? Like, what have you seen? Just not really sure if it's even remotely worth exploring, but just asking some basic questions. And as they're having this exchange, the voice that came on the phone during the call to the customer service rep for the internet provider came on the phone. And all of a sudden, Bill can't hear Michael, and Michael can't hear Bill. All they both hear is this voice, this like angry, kind of demonic sounding voice that sounds very threatening. And so while this is going on, Michael just instinctively is like, well, I have all my sound set up here, and he grabs a mic and he puts it to the receiver and starts recording. And for 1.5 minutes, he sits there recording this voice. And then about 30 seconds into the recording, not that Michael could hear it, Bill on the other end, who's heard this voice before, and he's starting to get the feeling that this whole thing is bad. Like it's bad. And he starts yelling to Michael to hang up. Don't listen to this. Hang up the phone. Don't listen to the voice. He's yelling for him. And then after about 1.5 minutes of this chaos that Michael's recording, the voice suddenly stops. And it goes back to Bill and Michael talking to each other. And it's like crystal clear. And so Michael immediately says, hey, Bill, you there? You there? And Bill's like, yeah, I'm here. I was trying to get you to get off the phone. You can't listen to this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's bad. And Michael just goes, no, listen, I recorded that. Here, let me play it back for you. And so he starts playing it back, and it's silence. Except for when Bill was yelling to Michael, don't listen to it. Hang up, don't listen to it. And Michael is yelling in the beginning to Bill like, hey, what is that? What is this? But then it's all silence in between. So they aren't speaking to each other, even though they're on the phone with each other. And they hear something, but the recording only picked up their voices, not the demonic, possessed sounding voice. At this point, Bill is starting to get a little bit scared. Maybe he wouldn't admit to it, but he's alone in this house and all this strange stuff is happening. And he just decides that he's going to invite his brother over for dinner. And Bill is in the chair that he always sits in, and Bob and his wife Cindy are on the couch, and they're kind of having a nice time. Bill recalled feeling, it was just nice to have other people in the house. And they're watching TV, and as they're watching TV, suddenly Bill just stands up and kind of runs over to the room where he had originally seen that thing dart by, this rodent or whatever he saw. And Bob and Cindy obviously see him get up and run over, and they're like, hey, what did you see? What was that? And Bill's like, okay, I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I saw this thing that's in my house. And, Bob, I brought you over here because I've just been seeing this animal or something running around my house, and I swear I just saw it. And he goes, hey, look, Bob, sit in my chair, because it was the only vantage point into this room. The couch where Bob and Cindy were sitting, they couldn't really see into this room. And he goes, just listen to me. Bob, sit in my seat and just sit here and just watch the TV. Don't pay attention to the room. Just watch the TV and just see if something catches your eye. Because, maybe I'm seeing something that is totally rational, but something's happening. Just do what I was doing. And so Bob's like, all right. So he sits in the chair. Bill sits next to Cindy, and they start watching TV again. And Bob, all of a sudden, just clearly reacts to seeing something in the other room. And he goes, oh my God, what is that? And they all stand up, and Bill is like, well, what'd you see? And Bob's like, I don't know. It was like some kind of small animal or something. And it looked like it was on 2 feet. It did not look like a 4-legged animal. That's like a 2-legged animal. Like, what was that? And so Bob, he's now feeling like, I was in that closet. Some weird stuff happened that I didn't tell Bill about. Now this, and he's like, okay, Cindy, his wife. Cindy, you sit in the seat. You do this now. And so now Bill and Bob are sitting on the couch watching Cindy, and Cindy's watching the TV. Of course, in just a matter of minutes, she sees something dart across the room. Now, was she just kind of jumping on the bandwagon because these two saw it? Maybe. But she certainly described the same thing that Bill and Bob claimed to have seen, which was a bipedal, small creature that was just running through the dining room. And so the three of them turn on all the lights, and they start searching the house. They're going to find this animal or thing in the house, and they search everywhere for hours, and they can't find anything. Finally, after, it's getting late, Bob and Cindy are like, hey, Bill, I don't know what's happening in your house, but why don't you just come stay with us? We got a guest room. Just crash with us tonight, and you can come back in the morning and call animal control or whatever you want to do, but just, you shouldn't be here tonight. There's too many weird things happening here. Bill, in a way, was actually kind of happy because now he had someone that he trusted and loved, his own family, that had confirmed that they were seeing the same things he was. That even though that is terrifying, that all of a sudden Bill is alone in this house with some creature, this small bipedal creature running around the house, at least he wasn't losing his mind. Or if he was, at least other people were too. So he was kind of relieved, and he was like, you know what? I'm not going to go with you because I don't want to just like give up my house. What will I do when I come back if it keeps happening? Like, I don't want to just give this up. So Bob and Cindy leave, and now Bill is determined to now, for the first time, start looking up paranormal explanations for what was happening. So quickly, Bill realizes that you can't just search the paranormal. There's too many things online. It's so hard to tell what is considered like credible and what isn't because there's just no fact checking going on. It's just people kind of putting things on the internet. And so what he decided he would do is, instead of him doing the research, he would find a paranormal investigative team that at least appeared to approach their investigations much the way a scientist would. That instead of looking for proof, the paranormal exists, instead that their approach would be like looking for an answer, even if that answer was totally normal. And so he starts researching for investigative paranormal teams that have a scientific focus that are in Texas in the area. And he actually finds one, and he reaches out to them, and they were actually available that night to come over. So he says, please come over. I need your help. So the leader of the paranormal team was a man by the name of Brian Hall. And when they get there, it's Brian and a couple of his crew members. They don't start with, diving into the paranormal investigation side. They start by looking for obvious answers because they've found that many times when someone claims they have a paranormal event happening, it's something like, a bad AC unit or a creaky door or a branch outside that's rubbing against the house. And so they did a very lengthy and thorough examination of the outside and inside of the house, looking for things like that. And they determined that there wasn't anything obvious that was a rational explanation, so now it warranted setting up some equipment. And so what they did is they set up a couple of cameras in Bill's bedroom where a lot of the activity apparently was happening, and they set up these laser beams that basically beamed lasers in every direction, and they would place them in his bedroom. So there was like laser beams all over the room. And if anything walked past any of these lasers, you would see the beams move, and it's very obvious. So it's a way to detect motion in the room. And so they set these beams up and they start filming, and for a long time, nothing is happening. Bill, Brian Hall, the team are just sitting in the dining room downstairs, just like listening to silence and watching nothing happen. And so Brian suggests, hey, why don't one of his team members go up and just literally interact with the room a little bit? Go in there, kind of like yell, do something, kind of stir it up, so to speak. And then we'll see if anything happens. And so one of the team members goes up to the room and walks in and is like, hey, is anybody in here? And, nothing's happening. You can see on the footage that, he jumps onto the bed and he's sitting on the bed. And at some point, as he's yelling out to whatever was in the room, like, hey, if you're in here, show yourself, all of a sudden on camera, you hear a laser fall. And he jumps out of bed and he runs out of the room. And the rest of the team comes up and they gather up the cameras and they immediately watch the footage. And as they're watching the footage, you can see this mist that begins to form in the room that the team member who was in there just didn't see. And the mist starts swirling in front of the laser beams on the camera before you hear off camera one of the laser beams falling to the ground. So at first they're just kind of dumbfounded and they're like, well, how did the mist get in there? Like, what is that? And is it possible that perhaps the laser beam rolled off a table or something? Maybe it was positioned in such a way that it could have rolled off. And so what they did is they raised the sound levels inside of the actual video, and they made out a couple of words. And so at this point, Brian Hall and his team feel like they have quite a bit of data that actually does lend credibility to the idea that there is something paranormal happening in Bill's house. So as they're packing up to leave, they say to Bill, like, you gotta go. You can't be here. Like, I'm surprised you're still here now. And Bill just was this super prideful guy, and he just was like, no, I'm gonna stay. Like, I've made the decision, I'm not gonna run. I'm gonna stay here in this house. And they're like, that's a bad idea. And honestly, they were right, because some pretty horrible stuff happens after they leave. So that night, he knows he's not gonna sleep. So he has all his lights on in his bedroom. He's sitting with his knees tucked up to his chin. He has upbeat music, like classical music, but very upbeat music playing on the radio right next to his bedside. And he's just trying to like kind of create good vibes in his room. And so as he's sitting there, he hears what sounds like a Mack truck smashing into the side of his house. Like, it was so loud and just deafening that he instantly sprints out of his door, runs downstairs, runs outside to like inspect the damage to his property. And nothing's outside. There's nothing. There's no Mack truck. There's no damage to his house. There's nothing. He walks all around his property. He's like, did something fall on the street? Am I losing my mind? Like, what's going on? And so he goes back in the house after quite a bit of looking around, seeing if something might have fallen off of his roof that made a sound. Nothing. He goes back in his house, and as soon as he steps foot in his house, he hears a similarly loud crashing sound, as if, a vehicle is smashing into his house, except it's inside of his house in his dining room. It was in the same room where he first initially spotted that thing running across the ground. And so he runs in there to look for some horrible damage to the inside of his house, but there's nothing disturbed. There's nothing shaking. There's nothing out of place. His dining room is intact. And as he's sitting there, he hears his car alarm go off outside. And now he's thinking, this thing is screwing with me. I'm not going to let it win. I've stayed here against better judgment for multiple days. I'm not going to give in now. And so Bill kind of goes into fight mode. Now he's mad. And instead of being scared of what's happening, he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, like, show yourself. And so as he's doing that, he hears yet another loud crashing sound up in his bedroom. And so he runs upstairs ready to fight with whatever this is in his house, because it's gotten to a breaking point for Bill. He charges in his room. There's nothing in there. But unlike the dining room, and unlike when he was outside, the crashing sound continues while he's in the bedroom. So he's standing in his bedroom, holding his ears from the deafening crashing sounds over and over and over again, but there's nothing moving. There is no way for the sound to be emanating from that room, but it is. And after what feels like an eternity of this horrible smashing sound, it just completely stops. And it's dead silence. And Bill lifts his hands off his ears and he's looking around, and he's expecting it to start again, but it doesn't. And it's just dead silence in the entire house. After quite a while, and he still doesn't hear anything, he gets back in his bed. All the lights are on. His radio's on. And he tucks his legs up to his chin, and he's just holding himself basically in the fetal position. And he is, at this point, he's now just petrified. He had his big fight moment, but I think he's now thinking that this thing was just challenging me back. It's basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you, and you can't touch me. I can do whatever I want, you can't touch me. And he's realizing that maybe he could have made it worse, and he's sitting there knowing he's not going to sleep. It's still the middle of the night, and he starts hearing a noise that sounds like maybe shuffling of feet, something's moving around underneath his bed. And as he's sitting on his bed, at the head of his bed near his pillow with his feet tucked in, he looks at the foot of his bed, and this huge, just wide, 6-foot-tall black figure emerges it's bright in the room. This black figure emerges at the foot of his bed. It's got this huge tooth coming out of its mouth, and it gets into this jerky position and starts moving towards Bill, and it gets right in front of him, and it puts its face right against Bill's, and then grunts, and then disappears. Bill continued to see this horrible black figure in his house, and it continued to kind of challenge Bill, and Bill stopped challenging it back. And so Bill started waking up with these scratches on his chest. He was hospitalized a couple of times, prompting the hospital to do welfare checks on Bill, because he was showing up with these mini heart attacks because of the stress that he claimed was from having this stuff happening to him. And his family's so concerned. And it wasn't until Bill started really doing some aggressive research on demons that he read about exorcisms. And he remembered that when he showed up for that house call, a lot of the language that he was hearing coming from that woman who was screaming, leave these people, leave this house, it sounded like an exorcism. And he was thinking that, do you think it's possible that the exorcist knew that she needed another host for these demons. And so she planned it so that she would have this water purification person show up right at 5 p.m. so that she could be at the part of her exorcism where she could cast the demons onto him. After 2 exorcisms of his own to his house, it still hasn't stopped. He still, to this day, is dealing with the paranormal activity in his house. And when asked why he hasn't sold his house, is he thinks that he couldn't live with himself if he ever put another person through what he has dealt with at his house. Late on the afternoon of June 14th, 1931, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Adolf Ruth climbed off his donkey that he'd been riding on for hours through the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Once he was off the animal, the doctor shook his legs to work out the cramps, and then he just took in the scenery all around him, and as he did, he smiled. Now, to the average person, what Dr. Ruth was seeing in front of him would look very impressive. There were all these jagged peaks on either side of him that jutted straight up into the sky that almost looked so steep they couldn't even be climbed. And this mountain range was cut through all over with all these twisting and turning canyons that almost seemed like a maze. Also, high up in these mountains were all these caves where people used to live, but now they were abandoned. In fact, today, if you were to travel through the Superstition Mountains, you could go days without seeing another person. And that was true back in 1931 when Dr. Ruth was there. But Dr. Ruth knew that where he was standing right now, between 2 towering rock walls, was not just a regular desert canyon. This particular stretch of desert was about to make Dr. Ruth a very rich man. He was going to be the very first person to actually find the Lost Dutchman gold mine. The same Lost Dutchman gold mine that had claimed the lives of hundreds of other treasure seekers who had come into the Superstition Mountains and not come out again. But Dr. Ruth knew he had a special advantage that nobody else who had come out here looking had had. He had a treasure map that was going to show him where this treasure was, and he knew it was right nearby. And without even thinking, he reached into his pack that was slung over his shoulder, and he felt the edges of the treasure map, which was folded up and tucked inside of his notebook. But as Dr. Ruth was daydreaming about finding this treasure, he heard someone grunt from behind him. And suddenly Dr. Ruth pulled his hand out of his pack, and he whipped his head around, and he looked at the 2 cowboy guides who had brought him out here, and Dr. Ruth just said, "What?" In Dr. Ruth's daily life, he was a retired veterinarian and a government employee who worked in Washington, D.C. He was a small guy with glasses and he walked with a limp, and he knew these 2 cowboy guides of his just thought he was some frail old man, and this deeply offended Dr. Ruth. And so, because the doctor totally resented these cowboys, he had told them that, yes, I need your help getting me to a particular spot in the desert, but once I get there, you guys are done. You can leave, I'll pay you, and you can just go away. I'll be fine on my own. And as it happened, they had reached this particular spot, and now Dr. Ruth is looking at these guys like, all right, let's go, get out of here, you don't need to be here anymore. But the cowboys, now that they were at this spot where they're supposed to go back home, they kind of hesitated before they left, because they looked at Dr. Ruth and they did think he was kind of a frail old man, and they knew all about how all these people had died going into this canyon to look for this treasure. And so the cowboy who had kind of cleared his throat and made a noise to get Dr. Ruth to turn around, he chimed in and said, "You know, doctor, I don't know if this is a good idea for you to go in there on your own." And Dr. Ruth, again, is super offended, and he just says to the cowboy, "I'm fine. Just go. I'm going to set up camp. I'm good. Get out of here." And then Dr. Ruth pulled out his wallet. He handed some money to the cowboys. The cowboys took the money. They looked at each other and just kind of shrugged. And then the cowboys turned around and began galloping away. And as they did, Dr. Ruth was standing there feeling kind of proud of himself for getting rid of these guys. But as they kind of faded into the distance, Dr. Ruth turned back around and he looked out at the landscape. And suddenly, now that he was actually all alone, a lot of his bravery was now gone. Now he was feeling maybe a little apprehensive. But Dr. Ruth reminded himself that he knew what he was doing. He was not a frail old man, despite the way he looked. He could handle himself, and he certainly knew this area well. He had a map, he'd be in and out, he would get that treasure, and then he'd be rich and famous.
And so, with that in mind, Dr. Ruth grabbed his things off the ground, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began slowly marching his way deeper into the canyon. A little while later, as the sun was starting to set, Dr. Ruth decided it was time to stop, and so he stopped his donkey, he hopped off, he found a clearing by the side of the trail, and he began setting up his campsite. And then finally, once the canvas tent was all set up and his campsite was good to go, Dr. Ruth started a small fire, and then he rolled a small boulder in front of the fire, and he sat down on it, and then he reached into his pack, and he pulled out that notebook, and from inside the notebook, he pulled out the old fragile treasure map. Dr. Ruth's son had acquired this treasure map from a man in Mexico, and this man in Mexico apparently got it from a family that used to do mining in the Superstition Mountains, and they had drawn out this map before apparently they were all massacred inside of the Superstitions, but somehow or another, their map they had drawn about where they thought this treasure was had survived, and so Dr. Ruth's son had gotten this map and given it to Dr. Ruth. And so Dr. Ruth held the map up and he stared at it for a second, and as he did, he couldn't help but be drawn to this huge rock formation way off in the distance. So not on the map, but actually in real life, basically far down the canyon, there was just this massive rock formation. And for a second, Dr. Ruth was looking at it, thinking it kind of looked like a huge oversized gravestone. And in a way, it kind of freaked him out. But he looked back at the map and he realized there actually was a drawing on this map that clearly represented this big rock formation. And on the map, it had an arrow pointing to this little drawing, and it said this thing, this big rock formation, was called Weaver's Needle. And according to the map, apparently the treasure was right near Weaver's Needle. And so Dr. Ruth was like, great, tomorrow I'll head straight for Weaver's Needle, I'll find the treasure, and I'll be rich and famous. And on that note, Dr. Ruth folded the map up, he tucked it back into his notebook, put it back in his pack, and then he took his beans and meat off the fire and he began to eat. And as he did, he whistled periodically to fill the silence that was filling the entire canyon. By the time Dr. Ruth was done eating his food, it was totally dark inside of this canyon, like completely pitch black and silent. And as the doctor was kind of taking in this moment of absolute darkness and silence, he was startled by a sudden sound coming from high up one of the canyon walls. It sounded like hooves marching on stone, and it kind of echoed through the whole canyon. And for a second, Dr. Ruth felt relieved, even though he had been adamant, especially to the two cowboy guides, that he wanted to go into this canyon by himself. Now that he was here by himself, and it's so dark and quiet and kind of spooky, he was glad to hear hooves because it meant that must be a person riding a horse, and so I'm not alone anymore. But when Dr. Ruth called out and said, "Who's there?" there was no response, and there were no more hoof sounds. It just went totally quiet again. And then, from all over the canyon, all Dr. Ruth heard was the yipping and howling of coyotes everywhere. By this point, Dr. Ruth couldn't help it. He felt terrified, and suddenly all he was thinking about were all the stories he had heard about unseen predators lurking in the shadows, stalking people who come into this canyon. And so Dr. Ruth decided, you know what, I'm just going to bed. And so he extinguished his fire, he packed up his things, and he went inside of his tent, and he laid down inside of his bedroll. And even though he knew he really wasn't actually safer in here, all he had was, canvas tent material protecting him from the outside world, but mentally, being inside the tent, he just felt safer. And so Dr. Ruth would lay in his tent in the total darkness, kind of on edge for a while, wide awake, listening intently for more hoofbeats or something out there. But there were no more sounds, the night remained silent and dark, and eventually Dr. Ruth fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, Dr. Ruth suddenly woke up, and it was totally dark and silent, and he sat up, and he looked out of his tent. The flap was open, and at first, he couldn't see anything. It just seemed like darkness out there. But then he realized, moving around very slightly, pretty far away from his tent, but not that far away, were two eyes staring at him, unblinking, just staring directly into his tent. And Dr. Ruth, his heart started to race, and he's realizing that an animal, a person, something is right there. And so Dr. Ruth, he was about to yell out when suddenly the eyes blinked and vanished. Dr. Ruth fumbled for his gun, and he drew it, and he aimed it out of the tent, and he yelled, "I'll shoot if you come back, I'll shoot!" But there was nothing. Dr. Ruth would stay awake for at least a couple more hours, just anxiously staring out of his tent, wondering if this thing, this person, whatever it was nearby, but he never saw the eyes again, and there were no more sounds outside. And so eventually, Dr. Ruth did lay back down inside of his bedroll, and he went to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, Dr. Ruth immediately went outside and began walking out in the direction where he saw those eyes to see if he could find some tracks on the ground. In his head, he was hoping he would find a bunch of coyote tracks, and that would explain, what these eyes were. Even though in the back of his head, he's thinking that didn't look like a coyote. And so as Dr. Ruth began walking in that direction, he did begin to see loads of coyote tracks all over the place. And so he's thinking, there it is. It was a coyote. My brain's just playing tricks on me. But he got maybe 15 or 20 feet away from his tent, and he noticed there was another set of tracks that were not coyote tracks. They were human tracks, or what appeared to be human tracks, like barefoot feet tracks, except the size of them were really small, like a child's foot. Now, Dr. Ruth was a really small guy and wore a men's size 6, so he had very small feet. And for a second, Dr. Ruth thought, oh, maybe these are my footprints. But he was like, I wasn't over here, and I wasn't walking around barefoot. So whose tracks were these? And then, making it worse, Dr. Ruth noticed these little prints, these little human-looking prints. They walked all the way over to the side of his tent, and they appeared to circle his tent over and over again. But then the prints didn't wander off and disappear. It's almost like the prints just continued in a circle, and then whatever this was making the prints just stopped where it was and vanished. At this point, Dr. Ruth was terrified, and he decided, let's just go towards Weaver's Needle, let's find this treasure and get out of here. And so he rushed back to his tent, he gathered up his things, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began heading towards Weaver's Needle, the thing that looked like a big gravestone. After riding for a couple of hours, Dr. Ruth was close enough to this huge formation that he was actually inside of the shadow cast by this Weaver's Needle. And when Dr. Ruth consulted his map, he saw that where the treasure was supposedly located was actually within the shadow of Weaver's Needle. And so he knew he was close. And so Dr. Ruth continued following the map as best he could. He turned this corner behind a rock formation, and then right up ahead, he saw this big wall of cacti that all had these axe heads lodged into their flesh, like someone had taken an axe and smacked the axe head in and then broken off the handle, but like dozens of times. And so Dr. Ruth stopped, and he's looking at these cacti, and then he looked at the map, and he realized on the map was actually a drawing that kind of resembled these cacti with the axe heads in them. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, this map is accurate. I've found another landmark. I must be near the treasure. And so now all he had to do was kind of back up and orient this cacti with the axe heads in it, with Weaver's Needle and its shadow. And if he could just orient it correctly, he would know exactly where to go. And after backing up and moving the map around a couple of times, he finally had it totally oriented, and he realized there was a path straight up ahead that would go right to the base of Weaver's Needle, and he thought, that's it, that's where I dig. There's the treasure. And so feeling excited, Dr. Ruth hopped off the donkey, he grabbed his pickaxe, and he began moving in the direction of where he was going to dig. But before he got there, he heard something behind him. He turned to look, but by the time he saw whatever was behind him, it was already too late. An explosion rang out, and then everything went dark. 10 days later, those two cowboy guides who had brought Dr. Ruth into the Superstition Mountains, they came back out to check on him, to make sure he was okay. And they found his campsite, and it was abandoned. And they searched the entire area, all the way down to Weaver's Needle and back, and there was no trace of Dr. Ruth. Over the next 45 days, a much larger search party was launched in this area to try to find Dr. Ruth, but at the end of those 45 days, there still was no sign of Dr. Ruth, and so the search was called off, and it was assumed that Dr. Ruth was dead. 3.5 months after that big search ended, so in December of 1931, another set of explorers were in the Superstition Mountains near Weaver's Needle, the big gravestone-looking rock formation, and they would discover a human skull on the ground. It was Dr. Ruth's skull, and it had 2 gaping holes in the side of it. A month after that, another set of explorers who were in the Superstition Mountains would find the rest of Dr. Ruth's skeleton located approximately 1 mile away from where his head had been found. But while the discovery of Dr. Ruth's body did provide some closure for his family, it actually only deepened the mystery of what the heck is going on in the Superstition Mountains. Because, one, despite the fact that Dr. Ruth's skull had been found with 2 holes in it, and the fact that his skull was found 1 mile away from the rest of his skeleton, Authorities who investigated his death quickly said Dr. Ruth died of natural causes, and they closed the case. And the second weird thing that only deepened the mystery was when they were searching Dr. Ruth's campsite, they would find his checkbook. And inside of his checkbook, there was all this writing that was clearly from Dr. Ruth, writing his checks. And then towards the back of this book, there was a relatively fresh-looking message, and the handwriting looked totally different than Dr. Ruth's handwriting, that just said, Veni, Vidi, Vici, which in Latin means I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, we don't know who wrote this message, but the running theory is whoever very likely killed Dr. Ruth wrote this note inside of his checkbook. But we don't know why they wrote this note. Now, eventually, people began to think that because of this note that was in his checkbook, that suggests that maybe Dr. Ruth really was on the precipice of actually finally finding this treasure, and maybe the stories were right about the Superstition Mountains, that something lurks in the canyon protecting this treasure, and when it saw Dr. Ruth was about to take the treasure, this thing killed Dr. Ruth to stop him, i.e. they came, saw, and conquered Dr. Ruth. Also, adding to the strangeness of this entire story, in 1945, so 13 years after Dr. Ruth's skeleton was discovered, an adventurer named Barry Storm published a book about his journey to try to figure out what actually happened to Dr. Ruth. And he would say in this book that when he went into the Superstition Mountains, somebody started firing a gun at him from off in the distance, and after taking cover and looking, he couldn't see anybody. And then when he began taking steps farther into the canyon to continue to explore, the shots rang out again. And so Barry Storm ultimately fled the Superstition Mountains, and he would tell people that whoever was out there shooting at him, it seemed like they were shooting warning shots at him. Like, if you come any closer, I'll kill you. To this day, no one has ever actually found any hidden treasure in the Superstition Mountains, but about 9,000 people will go out there looking for the treasure every year.
On May 21st, 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son, Eldridge, traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon, so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away, Betty went inside, handed her son to her mom, and went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. Now, Eldridge loved going to his granny's house because she had this enormous backyard for him to play in. If you were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass for him to run around in, and it butted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, looking straight out at the forest, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal, and there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed, you could clearly see. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed, so long as he didn't go right or left in the creek, which would put him out of view from anybody on the porch. And so this particular day, when Eldridge and his grandmother went outside, Eldridge wanted to go play in the creek bed, so he immediately starts running across the yard towards it, along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she just didn't have it in her to go all the way down to the creek bed, so she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. She remembers watching her grandson go all the way across the yard, get to the break in the trees, and then step down into the creek bed where he began goofing around with the dogs and throwing rocks and having a good time, clearly in view. And for the next 5-10 minutes, she just stared directly at her grandson and the dogs. And at some point, she picked up the book next to her and she began reading the book and then periodically looking up to check on her grandson and then back down to the book. At about 2 p.m., she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson yell out for help. Now, 3-year-olds yell out for help all the time. Sometimes it's a big deal, and sometimes it's not such a big deal. But oftentimes, the sound of their voice gives away how serious it is. No matter what they say, it's like their tone gives away, should I take this seriously, or is this just a kid being a 3-year-old? And she would say that the way he was yelling sounded like a real emergency. And when she poked her head up, even though she had seen him, less than a minute ago playing in the gap in the trees, now she's looking and he and the dogs are gone. And so, of course, she's alarmed. She hops out of her seat, she goes down the steps, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. And she's yelling his name and she's walking quickly. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again, except this time his voice was coming from way off in the forest, way farther away from the last time he had yelled out. It gave the impression to her that he had moved a great distance from the last time he yelled to her. And it triggered something inside of her that was telling her something is terribly wrong. And she began running towards the creek bed. Still no sign of the dogs. She can't see anything. She's just running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a third time, barely audible, way off in the forest. He yells out for help, and as he's yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops, and she looks out in front of her, and it's just dense forest, and there's no eldritch, there's no dogs, there's nothing. She looks to her right down the creek bed, and there's nothing down there, and then she looks to her left, and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away, facing away from her, and the dog is positioned in such a way that it's clearly looking at something. And so she runs down to the dog thinking she's going to see maybe Eldridge or the other dogs, but there's nothing beyond the dog. The dog is just rooted to the spot. Its hair is raised, it's growling, and it's taking little steps back like it's been spooked at whatever it's seen or whatever it's looking at. And she just looked up and tried to look in the direction the dog was looking, but there was nothing. It was just forest. And so at this point, she felt certain that someone must have abducted Eldridge. And so she turns, she tries to pull the dog to come with her, but the dog's not budging. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The two of them come back down to the creek bed. The dog is still in the same position, growling and staring in the same direction as if whatever it's looking at hasn't gone anywhere. And they look for a couple more minutes. They're yelling for Eldridge. And the grandmother is telling her daughter, look, I think he's been abducted. We got to call the authorities. And finally, she relents. And so they do manage to get the dog. They run back to the house and they call the police. Shortly thereafter, the state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers. And they immediately went down to the creek bed where they started pushing predominantly to the left side, which is where the dog was angled. And it was also where the grandmother had heard her grandson yelling from. And very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. They were in some sand right at the edge, and they were walking away as if he was leaving the area he had been told to stay in, which was in that gap in the trees. But interestingly, the footprints, it looked like he had been walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters when inexplicably the prints just stop, as if he stopped in the sand where he was. But had he gone right, left, straight, turned around, had he gone in any direction, there would have been additional prints in the sand, but there wasn't, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. For the rest of the day and that night, they would not find any more signs of Eldridge or the other two missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, there were a number of search crews that had gone well outside of the primary search area in hopes of maybe finding one of the two lost dogs because they thought maybe they could bring them to the lost child. And this one crew that was 4 miles away from where Eldridge had gone missing, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, which had fairly deep water, and they get to this clearing and they see there's this rocky overhang with high grass all around it, kind of forming like a cave. And they hear this whimpering again, and it's coming from underneath that rock. And they rush over and they're pulling the grass aside, and sure enough, tucked underneath this rock, inside of this kind of makeshift cave, is Eldridge. He was laying on this really well-constructed bed of leaves that looked like an animal's den. So either Eldridge had found an animal's den, or he had built himself this beautiful bed of leaves. When they approached him, he was sleeping underneath this rock, and so that whimpering sound he was making, he must have been making in his sleep. And so as they got closer to him, he woke up and he kind of sat up, and he's very groggy and confused. You know, all of his clothes were really badly torn up, and he wasn't wearing any shoes, but he overall seemed okay. He just was very confused seeming. And so they scooped him up and they brought him back to search headquarters, reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone's just so relieved that he's alive. But at the same time, people were like, how did he get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp? And so after the doctor cleared him, saying he was okay, besides some scratches and bruises, the police, along with the mother and the grandmother, sat down with Eldridge and asked him, you know, what happened? But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. He didn't even know he had spent 24 hours out in the middle of the woods by himself. It was like he had blacked the whole thing out. Because Eldridge was found alive and unharmed, the police did not continue to investigate this case. And so we don't know what caused him to suddenly be yelling for help and appear to be drifting farther and farther into the woods. We don't know what the dog saw in the creek that scared it so badly. We don't know how Eldridge moved 4 miles through a dense forest over multiple swamps only to wind up in yet another swamp inside of a cave. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. It's just very fortunate he was found alive. Unfortunately, there's no clarification about what happened to the other 2 dogs, although the way it's worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. Their house was on a very quiet street with very few neighbors anywhere near them, and their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section of their backyard and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake infested. And Anna was terrified of snakes, and so she happily obliged. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up, and Anna was gone. She immediately ran outside, and she's yelling for her daughter. She's looking all around, and she knows she must have gone into the forest, and she's thinking to herself, she must have been bit by a snake, and she's laying on the ground somewhere. That's why I can't see her. And so she runs into the forest and she's screaming for her daughter and she's not getting any response. She's starting to panic. All her yelling has gotten the attention of her 2 older sons that were in the house. They come running outside and they join the search and they start fanning out and they're looking for Anna and she's just gone. And so after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar that one of their own had gone missing, a child no less. And so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search. And they combed that whole forest behind their property, and there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. And within just hours of this change, there was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing, and they found Anna. And she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes. When they went up to her, she seemed okay. They picked her up and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her and the doctor said, there's no signs that she was attacked. There's really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It doesn't even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she wasn't able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she's only 2 years old. But the reason this case is included in today's video is not because, she vanished mysteriously in the forest and that she was actually found 3 miles away versus 1, or, that she was found with just a shoe on. The reason it's included in today's video is because for her to have been found where she was found, the only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. There was no other way for her to have gotten there. The only other way would have been a massive detour that she literally could not have covered. An adult probably couldn't have covered in the amount of time given. So this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. I mean, even if you take the barbed wire off of the fence, a 2-year-old climbing a large fence, that alone is kind of a Herculean task. And to do it without scratching your body, it's not possible. It's truly impossible. A May 7th article in the LA Times said the police were baffled by this 10 fence dilemma, and they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted or attacked or harmed in any way. It was just where she was found did not add up. Ultimately, the police came out with a statement saying this had to have been an accident, that Anna, the 2-year-old, managed to just somehow walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was, and thank goodness she's alive. But interestingly, the police confiscated her clothing and would not give that back to the parents, indicating there was further investigation happening even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed whether or not they actually discovered anything else about this case. And like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents did not press for more information about what happened to their daughter because she was found alive and unharmed. Now, Anna's case might seem like some crazy anomaly, and that's all it is. But this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. His mother estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds tops. The police and the community came out in force, and they combed through the woods, and they could not find any sign of Ronald. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up, considering the timeline you've given us, which is you went inside for 10, 15 seconds and your son is now completely gone. He's completely vanished. Like, you must have something to do with this. And so the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests, and his parents passed all of them. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately, it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. People in the area believe someone or something, maybe a bear or some other animal, was lurking in the tree line and watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went in the house, they ran up and snatched the child and ran away with him. However, the police came out and said there was no evidence to back up that this child had been kidnapped, that what's far more likely is Ronald just got up and walked away and disappeared. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, these similarities between her case and Ronald's case were just too much for locals to overlook. And so people began saying, it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald. But Anna was just lucky enough to survive. Although this mystery predator theory is just that, a theory, it does seem more likely than Ronald in 15 seconds getting up and running off into oblivion, never to be found again, and Anna scaling 10 barbed wire fences in a 24-hour period without a scratch on her body. Unfortunately though, we'll probably never know the truth. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. And then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up. And so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, They discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him. And then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety, but he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go on January 28, 1976, Daniel Halseth was born in a small town in Oregon called Estacada, which is located about 30 miles southeast of Portland. Daniel's family owned a farm, and so from a young age, Daniel became accustomed to getting up super early and helping out with daily chores. This childhood experience on the farm instilled in Daniel a strong work ethic, and it also taught Daniel to really appreciate family, because the family he had grown up in spent all their time together, and they all struggled and worked together every day to make ends meet. In high school, Daniel really began to blossom. He had this wonderful energy and huge radiant smile that drew people to him, and he was just one of those people that was just naturally gifted at everything he did, and it seemed totally effortless. During his high school years, he picked up playing the piano as well as the drums, and his classmates affectionately nicknamed him Drummer Dan. Daniel was also amazing with anything to do with computers or technology, and Daniel was just very handsome and very athletic and fit, and so he was really the guy that everybody wanted to be. But despite having all of these things going for him, Daniel was dealt a major blow in 1994 when he was in his junior year of high school. That year, his father, who he was quite close with, died unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. This was a crushing blow for a young man that still very much leaned on his father for guidance and support. But Daniel, like the rest of his family, found a way to just keep on going despite this immense heartbreak. In 1995, so a year after his father's death,
Daniel would graduate high school and he would head to Salem, Oregon, where he would go to school and earn his bachelor's degree in music, and then he would stick around in Salem at another university and he would earn his master's in business. And it was during those years that he was in Salem that Daniel would meet a young woman named Elizabeth Schwarak, who had grown up in Salem. She, like Daniel, was incredibly hardworking and was just naturally good at everything she tried. She was also a model, and so when she and Daniel began dating, they genuinely looked like this beautiful Hollywood couple. In 2001, which was shortly after Daniel had earned his master's degree, he and Elizabeth got married. 5 years later, the couple, who now were the proud parents of 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy, they moved to Las Vegas because Daniel had found work there. Daniel had founded this computer IT company because he was so skilled with computers, and it was really starting to thrive, and many of his clients were in or around Las Vegas. But just a few years after getting settled in Las Vegas, it would be Elizabeth's career ambitions that would take center stage in the family. Elizabeth had always wanted to get into politics, and in 2010, she decided she would run for a state Senate seat in Nevada. But in order to do that, she would need to campaign really aggressively, which would mean she'd be gone a lot of the time. And so Daniel, who was working full-time with this computer company, he would need to keep doing that because that paid the bills, but he would also have to become the primary parent for their 3 children. And so when she approached Daniel and said, I really want to do this, but it requires a lot out of you. Are you willing to do this? Daniel was completely supportive and actually really excited at the idea. He had no problems whatsoever. And so very soon, Elizabeth would be out on the road campaigning and trying to win the state Senate seat, and Daniel would be home goofing around with the kids and taking them hiking and going to playgrounds and parks. And then after he would put the kids to bed at night, he would stay up super late and run his computer business out of their dining room. And all this additional hard work and sacrifice that Daniel was making for his wife paid off when later that year, on November 2nd, Elizabeth, who had run this incredible campaign that was built on family values and wholesomeness and morality, she would win the state Senate seat, which shocked the state of Nevada. And even more impressive, she would become the youngest woman to ever be elected to Nevada legislature at just 27 years old. So it was clear to everyone in Nevada and also outside of Nevada that Elizabeth was destined for greatness. She was going to be the next big political superstar. And anyone who was close to the Halseth family knew Daniel was her #1 cheerleader. He was so proud of her. But soon, the Halseth's perfect life would come crumbling down. It was not long after Elizabeth had won her election that Daniel began to notice she was becoming suspiciously close with another man named Tiger Helgelian, who was a former golf pro and fellow rising political star. After noticing his wife constantly texting with Tiger, Daniel would actually reach out to Tiger directly and beg him to stop messaging his wife and to just leave his family alone. But the texting and the calling and the interactions between those two would not stop. And then finally, in October of 2011, so less than a year into Elizabeth's first term as a state senator, Daniel would find out that his wife and Tiger had been away together alone on this long extended work trip. And so Daniel realized that almost certainly his wife was having an affair. And so when his wife came home from this trip and she was unpacking in their bedroom, Daniel walked into the room and he accused her of being unfaithful. And the argument that ensued got very heated, but it did not become physically violent. Basically, Daniel just screamed and yelled at Elizabeth, swearing at her and kind of losing his temper completely. But at some point, Elizabeth just said, "Daniel, stop." And Daniel would actually stop. And in fact, both Elizabeth and Daniel, when they were called this night, would say as soon as she said stop, Daniel stopped yelling and he left the room. Over the next couple of days, Daniel and Elizabeth would go to therapy sessions at their church, indicating that they both were making a concerted effort to try to salvage their marriage. But on October 21st, 5 days after this big blow-up fight about the affair, Elizabeth would go to police and she would claim Daniel had touched her inappropriately during the fight they had over the affair. And so Daniel, much to his shock, was arrested and charged with something called open and gross lewdness, which is effectively unwanted touching of another person.
This accusation is quite common, especially amongst people at bars who are drinking. There's lots of unwanted touching that can happen there. But interestingly, this particular charge is cited as being one of the more frequently falsely accused offenses because the police do not require any physical proof to actually arrest someone. Basically, people are, in theory, able to get other people arrested simply by claiming they inappropriately touched them, even if there is not a shred of proof. It's basically one person's word against the other. After being found guilty of open and gross lewdness, Daniel was sentenced to 6 months of probation, anger management, and he had to register as a sex offender. Shortly after he was found guilty, Daniel filed for divorce. Their divorce, which was heavily centered on who gets custody of their 3 kids, was very contentious, it was very bitter, and it was very public. Because Elizabeth was a state senator, she was in the public eye, and because her campaign that she had run on to get elected was built entirely on wholesomeness and family values and having good moral character, that when rumors started to fly that she had had this affair with Tiger Helgelien and that had blown up her family and her husband is being charged with open and gross lewdness, it was just so salacious that despite her denying that she ever had this affair and acting like she was in the right, she was still forced to resign from her state Senate seat in February of 2012. The divorce would finalize later that year, and most likely because of Daniel's new sex offender status from the open and gross lewdness charge, he was denied custody of the 3 children, despite the fact that for the last several years, he had been the everyday primary parent. So Elizabeth, she gets custody of all 3 kids, and she promptly leaves Nevada to go to Alaska with her 3 kids to live with Tiger Helgelien, the man she denied having an affair with. And shortly after arriving in Alaska, she married Tiger Helgelien. Daniel was heartbroken. It was like his life had blown up in a matter of seconds. But most devastating of all was that his kids, who he called his 3 little angels, were now so far away from him, he couldn't even see them if he wanted to. But just like he had done back in 1994 when his father passed away, Daniel just found a way to keep on going despite this horrible pain he was feeling. Over the next few years, Daniel would pour himself into his computer business and really make that his full-time effort, and he would make every effort to see his children any chance he got. But because his relationship with his ex-wife Elizabeth was not good, it was really difficult to see his kids. Eventually, Daniel would meet another woman named Bogdana, and they would actually get married. And when that happened, it seemed like in the eyes of Daniel's family, he was starting to kind of finally get his life back on track. Around this time, Daniel began sharing more and more of his life on his social media channels. And every post he made, and he made lots of them nearly every day, were so overwhelmingly positive and optimistic, and it really showcased his wonderful personality that was all about lifting up your fellow person and just being a good human being. And he also posted loads of videos of him goofing around with his 3 kids because he adored his kids. They were the most important thing to him by far. But despite having this very cheerful outward presence on social media, privately, Daniel was dealt yet another very difficult blow in 2019 when his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of the second divorce remained positive and very optimistic for the most part, but anytime you saw an image of Daniel actually facing the camera, you could just see a distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as quickly as it seemed like once again Daniel's life was just going to crumble, something truly amazing happened for Daniel. Daniel's first ex-wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 kids decided to leave Alaska and come back to Nevada and resettle in Las Vegas. This was not because Elizabeth wanted to rekindle with Daniel. It was just because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to come back. And as soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited and so happy. In fact, by late 2020, Daniel's youngest daughter, Sierra, who was 16, she had basically just moved in with Daniel, even though legally speaking, she was not supposed to be doing that. And her mom, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But regardless, that was just how it was. She was living with Daniel. In August of that year, so around the time that Sierra had basically moved back in with Daniel,
Daniel decided to take his ex-wife, Elizabeth, back to court to see if he could get custody of Sierra, because Sierra was the only minor of their 3 children. She was still 16, and at that point, Sierra was already living with him. During the recorded video sessions between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel would tell the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not good for his children, and certainly not good for Sierra. Daniel would explain to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues, and what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved back in with him. Daniel also presented to the judge a letter that he said Sierra wrote that basically backed up the idea that she is better off living with her father. Elizabeth would generally respond to all of these things that Daniel was saying by saying Daniel was a liar and that he was not fit to be a parent, and that letter that he claims Sierra wrote doesn't sound like her, insinuating that, the letter was forged. The judge, who at regular intervals would get very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally would just say, look, you got all sorts of issues between the two of you, and it's creating a horrible environment for your kids. And if you don't find a way to come to some sort of compromise, the people that are going to suffer are your kids, specifically Sierra. Finally, in early 2021, when Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to terms, the judge just ordered that Daniel return Sierra to her mother's residence because, legally speaking, Sierra was supposed to be in her mother's care. And so begrudgingly, Daniel would take Sierra and he would bring her back to her mother's house and he would say, okay, go see your mother, and then he would drive off. But later that night, Sierra would sneak out of her mother's house and just run back to be with her dad. Needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that turn of events. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months, with Sierra opting to still remain at her father's place despite the court order, despite her mother pleading with her to come home. And then in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was shared between Daniel and his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just hadn't gotten around to relinquishing control to one or the other. And so these particular withdrawals were kind of uncharacteristic for Daniel or for Bogdana, and so they were flagged as potentially fraudulent, and so the bank sent notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana saying as much. And so Bogdana, she gets the messages that there's been these potentially fraudulent charges. She knows it wasn't her. And so she calls Daniel, but Daniel doesn't pick up. And so she texts Daniel. But again, silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little bit odd, Bogdana reached out to Daniel's mother, Christine, knowing that Daniel and his mom spoke nearly every day. And so she filled the mother in about what was going on. And after getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine would try calling and texting Daniel, but still got nothing. And so she reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. And so she calls Sierra. Sierra doesn't pick up. She texts Sierra asking to speak to Daniel, and Sierra doesn't get back right away, but eventually she responds to Christine, and the response just said, his phone has been acting up, but he's okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night. No worries. Now, Christine was relieved to read that her son and her granddaughter were just fine, but at the same time, there was just something odd about the fact that she could not get in touch with her son, and that Sierra was kind of acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her, and then sending a message that didn't quite sound like her. But either way, Christine just let it go and figured she would be in touch with her son over the next 24 hours. But the next day, by 10 a.m., when Christine and Bogdana had not heard or seen Daniel, Christine again reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. She called her, but she didn't pick up. And so she texted Sierra, this time demanding that she put her father on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message that said something to the effect of, my dad's in the shower, so he can't talk right now. Christine, at this point, it was like her radar was up, and she knew there was a real problem. She didn't know what it was, but there was a problem, and someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure he and Sierra were okay.
And so Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman, who was Daniel's landlord and a close friend of Daniel. And she asked Peggy, would you mind going and doing a welfare check at Daniel's house? And Peggy would say, of course, no problem, but I won't be able to get over there for at least several hours. So Christine said, no problem. But as soon as she hung up, Christine just was so anxious, waiting to find out what was going on with her son, that at 1:46 p.m., when still Peggy was out running errands and had not done the welfare check yet, Christine just called the police and asked them to do a welfare check.
Yeah, hi, I need a welfare check. I don't know if
On who are we doing a welfare check?
for my son. He's been missing for 2 days. His work's called, his family's called, I've called, his ex-wife's called, and there's nobody answering the phone, and there's nothing. Nobody can get a hold of him, and then his work called, and they can't get a hold of him, and it's really, he just doesn't act like this.
But as it would happen, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's residence ahead of the police. And so when they got there, they hopped out of their car, they walked up to the front door, and as they're knocking on the front door, they look over into the driveway and they see Daniel's car, which was a blue Nissan Altima, is not there. And so they're knocking, they're seeing the car is not there, it's totally silent in the house. And so Peggy, she reaches down and she tries the doorknob and she finds it's unlocked. And so she twists the knob, she opens the door, and she and her friend step inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend would come running out of the house, and Peggy would call 911 because the police weren't there yet, and she would frantically try to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen. 24 hours earlier, a man and a woman were spotted on surveillance camera withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. Those were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent and tipped Bogdana off that something could be wrong here. After those withdrawals, the man and the woman were spotted again on camera going into a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco, and inside they would purchase a few items using Daniel's debit card, and then they would leave and they would head to a Las Vegas Home Depot, where once again they'd be caught on camera purchasing a few items using Daniel's debit card. After these purchases, the man and the woman would make their way to Daniel's residence, where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima car was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence and then quickly turned around and ran out and called 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's residence on April 9th, and they pulled up and they saw Peggy Newman and her friend totally ashen-faced and pacing on the sidewalk, the police would get out, they would talk to those two, they would go inside of Daniel's residence, and they would see the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had also seen. But the police could not make sense of what they were seeing. It really just did not add up. Then, 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to find the man and the woman that were seen on camera on April 8th using Daniel's debit card and going to the Winco and the Home Depot. The police, they just happened to find these people on a bus in Salt Lake City. And after going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police would discover a video that these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days that explained what was inside of Daniel's house.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Day 3 after murdering somebody.
Whoa! Don't put that on the camera.
It was worth it.
The young man and the young woman you just saw joking on camera about murdering someone were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of all those different ATMs, they had gone to the Winco and purchased disposable gloves and bleach and drop cloths, and they had gone to the Home Depot and purchased a circular saw and saw blades and lighter fluid. And then they headed for Daniel's house. It's not been made public what actually occurred inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few assumptions. Daniel adored his children. There was no act there. He truly loved his children.
And so it would never cross his mind that one of his children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. And so when Sierra and Aaron went inside of Daniel's house, it would have been extremely easy to sneak up on Daniel or just kind of catch him off guard because he's not looking to put up a fight. He thinks he's around people that love him and respect him because he loves and respects them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds in Daniel's body, most of which were in the back of his head. And then at some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag, and right in the middle of the living room of his house, they doused him in lighter fluid and lit him on fire. It's unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening before he died, but it's very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized his beloved little angel, Sierra, was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the sink, and then they retrieved their circular saw as well as a chainsaw and began attempting to dismember Daniel's body. But they were unable to do it, and so they just kind of set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home with bits of Daniel stuck on the grooves of the saw. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy evidence inside of the house by scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was totally ineffective. And so at that point, the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down, and that would destroy all the evidence. And so around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back, "Oh, he's in the shower, he can't talk to you right now," that was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to burn the house down. But the fire they set was just not very big, and it kind of smoldered out. And so they would just kind of leave all of the evidence all over Daniel's house, and they would leave Daniel's destroyed and burned body kind of propped up against the door leading into the garage. And they would just leave the house, hop in Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning, they would leave Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to apprehend Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because the couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and hopped on a bus, and Aaron had not paid the fare. He had just snuck onto the bus. And so at some point, the transit authority had come through the bus, and they were asking people to show their tickets, and Aaron didn't have one. And so when they discovered this, they asked for his name, and when they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas PD were actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows why she turned on the one man who would forever love her and would forever support her, what we do know is around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth had gone back to court and they were having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide who was going to have custody over Sierra, Sierra had begun dating Aaron, and she had fallen totally in love with him, and it seemed very much like Aaron had totally fallen in love with her. And somehow Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were planning to run away secretly and go move to Los Angeles. And so when Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife Elizabeth, and then they would go and talk to Aaron's parents, and they would tell them about this plan to run away. And both sets of parents talked and decided it was in both child's best interest if they stopped seeing each other. And so starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their child from seeing each other, and that was it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision, because Sierra was at the time living with Daniel, it seemed like she focused her rage about this decision on Daniel because he was the one kind of enforcing the rule. And so it's believed in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out, saying that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of this confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves talking about murdering Daniel, they have pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial.
In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3 mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong. And she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but she couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. In September of 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe, and Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the right to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the 2 boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the 2 teenage boys had not seen a single elk, and so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area, and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait. And an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, still no sign of their dad. They can't get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they're thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he's got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. And so as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just this Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their mind. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he's trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager, and so we'll just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed, but more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to invincible Robert, that just didn't add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter is in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He's all alone. He's an experienced hunter, and he's not on a path. He's just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it doesn't really register with him. It's only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he couldn't see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. And so he starts walking towards the crow. He still can't see it. It's very thick vegetation, and he's getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It's in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It's like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over, and this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump. And the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he's kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter. And it recognizes the hunter can see the crow. And the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow, because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him, and he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. And the hunter's standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter's so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who's looking at him again, and the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is, and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up, and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and the skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull, it was also a human femur bone right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded, but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said actually he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly he wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree. So who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where is his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid, meaning had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So the fact that he wasn't found means either hundreds of people didn't see him, including a helicopter with thermal imager, or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many, many people do, then do you really think it's a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I don't know. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone, and they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here. And that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking, how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this. This is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine, But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5-mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on.